Typically, I'm not confronted so much with these policy papers, and I found it very interesting to read these papers, I should say, even though I don't want to go into very details in my commenting. Of course, data science is becoming ever more important, but of course, on the other hand, observing a saturation poses the question, and what does it really mean? What's the interpretation? And there could be one of stabilization, but there could also be, in fact, one of potential crisis. In particular, quantity, of course, doesn't tell us much about quality. So while the international order may still be kind of moving on slowly, we don't know how good the quality of those institutions would really be. The other two presentations I will address with this talk over here, and I will go a little bit beyond and also share my own concerns about this subject. I hope that's fine with you. So, I personally have the impression that the international liberal order got in trouble, and I think the talks that we've seen have actually captured a couple of things pretty well. So, for example, the role of US hegemony and its decline, the role of reserve currency, the role of the falling gold standards, elaborated in the papers maybe more than in the talks, the role of globalization, the role of neoliberalism, the role of automation. And also it was observed that we basically have a regime of principled pragmatism rather than the proclaimed value-oriented approach. What I think should probably be emphasized more is the role of money creation itself, that means the fiat currency system, the role of old powers that probably have been challenging this US hegemony, and the role of the NATO, of course, the role of new powers like the industrial military complex, the role of environmental and sustainability pressures, the role of China and the BRICS countries, and of course other international organizations also. They're challenging that international liberal order to some extent, and the role of the digitization. And in fact, I will show you some quotes over here, for example, by Peter Thiel, who says, "We're in a deadly race between politics and technology," and he thinks that actually technology should win and politics should lose, and we don't need politics any longer. That's my interpretation. Or Mark Zuckerberg was demanding move fast and break things. That was basically the motto of Facebook. And the motto of Google for some time, it's not anymore like this, was don't be evil. But then they wanted to try out a lot of things that they complained they couldn't do because there were laws that were basically preventing those things from happening. I'd like to try to reconstruct what happened since World War II, and I'm not a historian either, but anyway, maybe you still find my reflections useful. Even World War I, I would say. So these experiences of World War I, of the fascist dictatorship, and then World War II and the Holocaust really had a deep impact on the international order, and in particular, democracy and human rights were supposed to protect us from the repetition of such evil. And so constitutions were introduced or updated, and in particular in the German constitution, also others, human dignity has an outstanding role. That's basically only one of two articles among the many articles of the constitution that cannot be changed in the future. And so it's basically the most important article. And that's also why it's Article 1, right? So that is really the basis of democracies and human rights, and basically everything should derive from this. So if you could say a politician has basically one main job: to protect human dignity and to advance it. And everything else should derive from there. But a lot of things have happened since then, and I think a lot of wrong turns have been taken. So in particular, this task of protecting human dignity was often interpreted as job creation and so supporting business, and I think it didn't end very well. And for that reason, of course, politicians listen a lot to lobbyists and to industry, and we all know how it ended. Dieselgate is just one of the shameful examples where basically it's totally visible that politics lost control and business does what it likes. And partly this is because there are so many interconnections between politics and business. And politicians were thinking they were doing the right thing. Let's stress that again. Then moreover, in an era of digitally unleashed automation, equating human dignity with jobs couldn't work well. It would get politics under pressure, and this is what happened over many decades now. So now we are entering an age of robotics and artificial intelligence, and it's clear that we are experiencing the next economic revolution. And if you look into history books, then you basically know what will happen in these times. There would be financial and economic crisis, and there would be revolutions and wars. And in fact, in a sense, now revolutions and wars have solved unemployment in the past. Of course, it's not considered to be an appropriate solution, but this is basically what happened. And this is what we need to avoid this time, because if it happens this time again, it will be much worse, right? And in fact, worse comes to worse, we also have a massive sustainability problem, and we know that for many years, since the early 70s at least, and has been this limit to growth study and also the Global 2000 report to the President of the United States. And basically the implication is that because the resources of this planet are limited, we would sooner or later run into resource issues, and there would be most likely economic and population collapse. And for that very reason, the United Nations Agenda 2030 with its Sustainable Development Goals was established. There are other agendas aiming into a similar direction, and those goals read very well, but actually it's not so clear how to get there, in particular how to do that within the time until 2030 with the population on this planet. In response to the projected problems in the early 17th, an environmental movement started to form. So people were using jute instead of plastic. There were these car-free Sundays and things like that. But apparently the industry didn't like this very much, and they said, let us just solve the problem and clear the way for us. And so basically neoliberalism came and globalization came and things like that. So rather than replacing capitalism 1.0 that was over-consuming resources in advanced countries, or industrialized countries I should rather say, it was decided to replace democracy by something else. And in fact, you can read this in books like this one, like the First Global Revolution. And here are some passages like the limits of democracy. Democracy is not a panacea. So basically here is where they started to question democracy, and it took a couple of more decades until basically now it is almost broken. And also they were framing the the enemy of humanity as being man, and here they even say the real enemy then is humanity itself. So there's a war against humanity going on, in a sense, one could say. And so, even though it was known already in the early 70s that the industrial countries were over-consuming resources and that will create huge problems, the problem was exported to the entire world. Through the fiat monetary system, through globalization, through neoliberalism, through free trade, and so basically the problem was amplified, and so now we have sustainability problems all over this planet, right? And we all know how fiat currency exploded the amount of money and investments and resource use, and we also know what it costs in terms of debt created, and you can clearly see who is guilty. These are the industrialized countries who've been overusing resources, and of course, and basically if there's not enough resources in your country, you would take them from other countries, so that required free trade, and that was basically the outcome. And in the end, even Rockefeller realized that that was something that shouldn't have happened. And now, okay, so we decided for globalization, rather than enforcing US and European environmental and social standards worldwide, globalization was used to undermine the progress already made, to put pressure on labor markets and on our production system and so on. And this is the outcome. So this is how it looks like in those countries where we were pushing for globalization. And of course also overpopulation was caused by the business practices of oil industry and related businesses, because it was driving the population growth. Let's face it, it was something like an over-fertilization of our planet, and so it was predictable that a massive increase in death rates would follow. We know that from ecology. And there it's a crime if you over-fertilize a lake or whatever, because it would cause deaths. And you know, that's predictable, and that's even in the limit to growth study. Look, death rates would go up dramatically within this century if we wouldn't change the system. For example, towards a circular economy, then it wouldn't have to look like this. But that circular economy hasn't been built. So basically, our planet is headed towards a scenario similar to this, and apparently politics and business has accepted such a thing to happen. So I personally think such over-fertilization constitutes a serious environmental crime and a crime against humanity. Rather than blaming consumers, they're irresponsible business practices that are to blame. And so basically the accident happened, the planet got out of control, liberal international order couldn't be sustained, and so after 9/11, a big data-driven and AI-controlled society was suggested to be the solution. It was forced upon the world via the war on terror. And we know that basically data collection is enormous. You probably have no idea how much personal data is being collected about you every day. It's several gigabytes, according to what I read. And so there are companies that know more than everything about you, more than your friends or family, and that knowledge can be used also to steer your thinking, emotions, decisions, and behavior. AI can learn how you respond to certain kind of information input, and that can be used to manipulate you. And so Tristan Harris has described it very well. He was working in the Google control room, and here in his TED Talk he describes how a handful of tech companies controls billions of minds every day. This kind of technology has originally been developed by and with secret services. We know that since Snowden, just we haven't interpreted it well enough, because at this time we didn't realize these technologies were applied to entire populations of hundreds of millions and even billions of people. Then even eventually consumption decreased, and the industry didn't like it, and so it tried to force consumptions upon us through neuromarketing, which is more effective than the old-fashioned marketing that we knew before with posters and so on. And that kind of technology was also being used to manipulate elections, and the technology was basically sold to politics as liberal paternalism, and so basically as something which is democratic and fine, and in fact it's actually a mind control technology that has been largely misused and is part of international information warfare. And if you inform yourself well about it, then you can really conclude that things have gone badly wrong over here. And in fact, now we're heading towards a digital prison, justified by cybercrime and also by those sustainability issues. And so to watch and control the use of resources and the behavior of the people, a digital panopticon was created. It was even an MIT project that showed this picture in the background. But in principle, you know, the British Secret Service, for example, has created such a program. It's called Camera Police, that observes every behavior and judges. It's something like a digital judgment day, and basically a pre-crime program that's not only judging theft and burglary and these kind of things, but also whether you have a favorable environmental behavior, or whether you are critical about the politics of your leaders or not, and all of that would get plus or minus points. Currently tested in China under the label Citizen Score and others, and so that's pretty much technological totalitarianism, and it can be even rooted back to fascism, unfortunately. This technology was spread to autocratic countries where it was tested and applied. And yes, if you think this is okay, because some Chinese seem to like it, even we have read that there were these educational camps where probably more than 1 million Uyghurs were basically put, and so that these are, you know, not so different perhaps from concentration camps. Certainly debatable, but certainly not something that we would consider as part of an international liberal order. And then on top of this, political leaders have started to question human rights also in democratic countries. You know, Erdogan was mentioning Hitler Germany as an example. Japan's vice premier found Hitler's intentions right. Theresa May was thinking that human rights laws should be changed for terror fight, and also in Switzerland there are political parties that were questioning human rights. This is from mainstream newspapers, right? So the question is, will democracy survive big data and artificial intelligence? Will the international liberal order survive given those developments and the sustainability pressure? And in fact, I consider the situation very seriously. I think this international liberal order is in a process of breaking, and democracies are in a danger, in a really serious danger. And so the final stage of this development, if we don't interfere now, would be that this could happen. We were talking about so-called overpopulation, and that is a book that was recommended to me by somebody whose business it is to deal with the future for our societies. learning to die in the Anthropocene. And in fact, all this debate about those trolley problems and automated driving is in fact about this, to basically hand over decisions about life and death, our lives and our death, to autonomous systems, to AI systems that would judge your value based on your behavior. Now, is it that serious? Probably yes. Pentagon is already preparing for some time for mass civil breakdown. You could read on the newspapers, and basically the super rich all have their doomsday bunkers, so they know their system is not going to work forever, and still they're running this system. Is this responsible? Should we allow them to do that? That's the question. And so I personally have the feeling that our institutions are about to fail or have failed, basically to point the finger at those problems, to call for solutions to fix those issues. And we've seen basically a power grab that has happened by digital means, which has turned a democracy of which capitalism was a part into a surveillance capitalism and similar systems in which democracy or society was a part. Some people talk about market-conform democracy. So in conclusion, many capital mistakes have been made, I believe. Economic growth and jobs have been put over human dignity. Lobbyism has been allowed. Using digital means, automation has been driven to entirely new levels, putting, of course, our society under pressure and people. In response to the expected resource shortages, environmental problems, democracy was identified as the problem, not capitalism. I'm not a communist at all. No, don't get me wrong. Just I think we need to have an upgraded democracy and capitalism, and the digital technology can help us to do that, but we have to do it. And then rather than solving environmental problems, one decided for expansion, globalization. So the spread of the oil-based economy has caused overpopulation and environmental destruction. The environmental challenges have become much worse than in the 70s. Man was declared as enemy of humanity, and saving the planet was used as an argument to control humans. I mean, the people and nature were framed as enemies. The political and economic system seemed to figure in the early deaths of many millions of people because of the unsustainable system that has been maintained. Actually, had we just reduced in all those years since the 70s our resource consumption by 3% a year, which wouldn't be that much, we would be sustainable by now all over the world. You know, that would have been doable, but it hasn't been done, unfortunately. So after 9/11, the war on terror and surveillance-based societies were created worldwide in a state of hybrid war and unpeace, as some people call it, in particular military people spread. This included the global use of tools of information warfare and mind control. Technological totalitarianism was increasingly spread, and human rights questions. Big data-driven and AI-controlled societies seem to increasingly replace democracies. So elections are being undermined. Code is law. That means lawmaking is being undermined. Participation is undermined. Many things are being undermined. That is a serious development. And probably we should have paid more attention to the basis of power that's now being misused by some parties. I mean, money, resources, corporations, networks, secret services. This was not sufficiently contained and democratized. So the question is, when will we act? The power structure and corporate control network must be fixed, must be more decentralized, I think. Subsidiary organization must be put in place. And in fact, you know, the good news is there would be solutions for the world's challenges, and even liberal ones, but they haven't been implemented yet. I admit that some of those are pretty new, but you know, for 50 years nobody has really called for them. We could have had public debate about it and work it out and put it in place, but apparently that was not wanted. Some people think we are in an alternative-less situation, we just need to let it happen. No, I don't think so. I think we need to correct the mistakes, and actually there were many wrong decisions made, and we need to hold the responsible decision makers accountable and start the change that is necessary. Now the floor is yours for debate. Thank you.